Irene sent in a question, and this is a question. My concern is that the vaccine was able to be made very quickly due to a new technology. Instead of using the dead virus RNA, I don't know what that is, you enlighten me. Instead of using the dead virus RNA is used. And I've heard people wonder if ultimately it could cause a change in our DNA or RNA. Now, for those of us who all we know is the bass clef and the treble clef, RNA, what's that? DNA, how does that change? And the question.
Right. So I think that this is one that I hear frequently, and it's something that is being proliferated on social media and elsewhere out there. And I think people have valid concerns, because what we're talking about here is genetic material. And if you have genetic material, which is now a component of a medicine, a vaccine, then certainly it's right that you scrutinize exactly what the technology is and exactly what benefits or even adverse effect it may have. In terms of RNA, what that acronym is, it's ribonucleic acid. Ribonucleic acid. And when we speak about DNA, it's deoxyribonucleic acid. And really, that's the difference between the two, or one of the differences rather. When we talk about deoxy, we're just simply speaking of the removal of an oxygen molecule. That's what we mean by deoxyribonucleic acid. So on your DNA, the oxygen molecule, which is part of that structure, is removed, whereas it is very much present on the RNA structure. I hope that is clear. DNA is basically carries the genetic code of our body. So that's what we talk about when we talk about chromosomes and genes. That's all the genetic information which is embedded or encoded in your DNA. RNA, on the other hand, carries the information to make amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins. So put simply, I suppose you could say RNA carries the information to make a protein. So really, that's the distinction between the two of them. DNA is really your genetic information. RNA carries your protein information. And that's what it is. What is clever about this virus, and I'll come back to answering the question as to whether or not this can somehow modify one's genetics. What is clever about this particular vaccine is that it bypasses the conventional approach of making a vaccine. As was rightly said in your question, that would normally use a form of virus, attenuated or non-infectious form of the virus, which will be injected in the human body to elicit an immune response, much like we've spoken about just before. But this time around, however, this RNA is being isolated. And this particular piece of RNA that's been isolated, remember I said it carries the message to make protein, carries a particular message to make the spike protein of coronavirus. And the spike protein is this protein that sits on the surface of the virus. So if you imagine the virus as just a round football, and it's got these spikes coming out of it. That's what the spike protein is. The role of the spike protein is to attach to cells when it gets into your body. And so what happens with coronavirus in particular, once it gets into your system, it travels to your lungs and other parts of your body where there is this protein in your body called the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, or ACE2. And that's what the spike protein binds to. And in binding to it, it is able to affirm or attach itself in a secure way to the human cells. And eventually what happens, it fuses with the membrane of that cells and then internalizes into that cell. And that's how it begins this process of replicating itself, building more virus particle and spreading infection throughout other parts of the body. And of course, the body will react to that, and you'll get adverse events such as inflammation, which is why a lot of people may end up on the ventilation system, for example, and have difficulties breathing. So really, that's what happens. What is clever, what scientists have cleverly done now, is to take the genetic information, the RNA that carries the information for making the protein, the spike protein, and use that to formulate the vaccine. What will happen now is if this vaccine is injected into somebody, that RNA information will be read by the body's machinery. Our body is incredible at extracting information and building things. So that RNA information will be read or translated by the body, and the message will be clear. This is a piece of RNA that carries the message to make the spike protein of the virus. The body will then go on.
How was science able to make it so quickly, considering it said that typically 10 years is what it takes to make a vaccine? How are they able to do it in under a year?
we're in unprecedented times here. What we have is a virus which has pretty much shut down the global economy. And of course, when we consider the economy as well, that is going to have, if the economy is poorly functioning, that's going to have significant impact on people's lives as well, not just a virus infection. And there is I guess, a balancing of priorities here: public health, good economics. And as a result, what has gone into medical research over the last year or so has been an unprecedented level of investment. So the pounds are speaking here, the dollars are speaking, whatever currency you're using, they are speaking. Governments have been pouring in a lot of money into scientific infrastructure, vaccine research and development, diagnostic tools, and so on and so forth. And really, when there is money in the system, things tend to move at a much faster pace, because you can begin to actually get and develop those technologies, which are not scientists. One thing about scientists, that scientists are always full of ideas. We will sit with our peers, we will discuss our ideas, we'll discuss the feasibility of them, we'll have them sketched out in a book somewhere, but those ideas will never become a reality if the money isn't there to back them or support them. And so if we have government now, as a result of this national or international emergency, pouring in a lot of funds, things are going to be moving at pace. There are those individuals who are going to open their notebooks and say, wow, I've had this idea for ages. Now I've got money to pursue it and to run with it. And so it's not that the thinking started immediately at the moment when the virus was revealed or when the need for a vaccine became known. There was long-standing contingency plans at work. In fact, scientists have been modeling for decades that a viral pandemic is coming, and how is it that we will best deal with that when it presents itself. So a lot of infrastructure was already in place, a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas were already being noted and documented as to what we would do should we get to a situation like this. And I think that's what we're seeing here in part.
So in simple terms, those who worry that the vaccine will change their DNA and change who they are. I mean, I've seen the memes of 2 minutes after taking the vaccine, you turn into a gremlin and we laugh about it, but in some kind of way, I know it's seeded into people's consciousness, the idea that if I take the vaccine, it's going to change me. So are you saying that's possible, or are you saying it's not? And if it's possible, how do I know whether this vaccine can do that or whether another vaccine can do that? How can I mean, I'm a layman. How can I figure that out?
It's RNA, and therefore what we know about the fundamentals of biology tells us that that is not possible. And why do we know that this is not possible? It is not a DNA vaccine. COVID-19 is not a DNA vaccine. Sorry, it's not a DNA virus. It's an RNA virus. So you do have two categories of viruses. You have DNA viruses and RNA viruses. DNA viruses just means that the genetic material within that virus is DNA, like we spoke about earlier. A prominent example of that is hepatitis B virus that causes infection of the liver, leading on to cancer, fibrosis, and other things. And what that virus does when it gets into your system, it incorporates its genetic material within your genetic material. So it goes to the core of your cells, which is your nucleus, which contains the DNA, and it incorporates its genetic material there. And that can lead to some genetic modification, such as mutation. And that's how the cancer developed when you get infected with hepatitis B virus, or one of the ways in which the cancer developed. With an RNA virus, that's just not possible. This RNA molecule does not go into one's nucleus and interact with one's DNA. Okay, it's pretty much in the cytoplasm, or that space of fluid and liquid within your cells. And that's how other proteins in your body are able to see it and say, what information is this carrying? Begin to read that in order to make the spike protein that we were speaking about earlier. And that spike protein will be presented to the immune system of your body to say, here's a foreign object. Attack, and develop an immune response against it, such that if the real virus comes along, which has a spike protein on its surface, again, the body will be able to recognize that. So I think there is no need to worry on this one in terms of one's DNA being affected or modified by the RNA vaccine. It certainly doesn't make sense biologically, from what I know anyway about the fundamentals of biological science.
Okay, so I've got so many questions that I'm not going to be able to get through because of time. So maybe you'll grant us another time. But here's a question from Richard. And Richard says, if the side effects of the vaccine is as low as being portrayed? Why is the government given protection to these pharmaceuticals that will prevent people from suing them if things go wrong after taking the vaccine?
I think it's premature to report a complete safety record of the vaccine at this particular juncture. I don't think there is enough data available yet to really come to a decisive conclusion on what the side effects of the vaccines are. When the vaccine went through clinical trials, a trial cohort or a group of individuals that are involved in the trial is not the same as a wider population of individuals. When you take this into wider population, you'll begin to see things emerge that you wouldn't have seen from the trial patients. And that's because that's a smaller group. And as you go into a larger, diverse ecosystem, you will obviously, or evidently, inevitably, I should say, see interesting responses coming through. And that's why I say caution, because we will not know the full safety record of this vaccine. Perhaps we'll be talking about this a year from now when more data or more information has come through after a number of individuals have been vaccinated.
You say caution, but
Okay.
the impression people have is they've been told the government's told you must have this. Is there from your perspective as a scientist and in the medical field, is there a compulsion on people's sides to have the vaccination as far as you know, or is it a choice that they have at the moment?
At this moment, it is a choice. There are various employers out there who are recommending it, but it's not something from anyone that I've spoken to that's being forced upon oneself. So there is recommendation there. Whether or not that policy will change over time is yet to be seen. So that's very much is something to be aware of. In terms of science, I think I'll briefly just mention how science works, and it's very different to politics and policy here. I think for the government, there's health economics at work here as well. What is good, what is prosperous, what is productive for the economy. And if we have more people able to go back to work and so on and so forth, then a vaccine is the obvious and most successful route out, potentially. From a scientific perspective, scientists are very much always interested in robustness and reproducibility. And what I mean by that is that data must be scrutinized repeatedly. And if the evidence changes over time, then science must change with the evidence. So for example, if 6 months down the line, we're finding out that there are some safety issues, science will then decide, okay, this needs to be looked at again. If 6 months down the line, there is some information coming through saying, actually, the level of immunity conferred by this vaccine is not that significant, then science will evolve with that as well and begin to address that. I'm not quite sure government policy or politics is as easily adaptable and evolving as science would be.